Le Pont, our new interactive internet debate. Nelson is here online with me. I'm Hugo Mathieu, and we're here to talk about what we've been doing for the last year, actually, with the Bridge, is promoting understanding and discussion between Canada's distinct societies. Now, Nelson, I'm aware that you have something that you really want to talk to us about and to explain to our listeners. It's Canadian federalism. Now, if you don't mind, I have a first question for you. How was Canada's federal system created?
Okay, so the principle of federalism is the reason why we started the Bridge. This is very fundamental. The idea is you have two separate levels of government which are sovereign within their domains. So you have a provincial government that can do whatever it wants, write whatever laws it wants for its area, the federal government which can do the same for the subjects it has. How do we decide who gets what? Well, this was very strictly laid out in 1867 in the Constitution. There's literally lists in the constitutions which will lay out areas. We've talked about this before on the Bridge, whether it's telegraphs, health and education, just very specifically, this government takes these subjects or topics, and this government takes the others. Now, it's interesting to note that when this was created in 1867, these were a bunch of British colonies, and they had to come up with a deal that would work for them. All right.
So how did this coming up of the deal work out?
Well, like anything else, it was negotiated. Apparently, there was a record number of champagne bottles that were brought over to Charlottetown for the talks. In the end, the practical side of it was that they never really negotiated the question of which level of government would have the final say. So in this case, this meant that the idea of residual power, which in the United States, for example, is explicitly given to the individual states.
Okay, hold up. You mean residual power. Could you please explain to us what residual power means?
That just means if a given area, for example, airplanes, is not explicitly listed in the Constitution in 1867 because airplanes didn't exist in 1867, who gets jurisdiction over it?
Okay, all right.
So in Canada, this was actually figured out by a judicial decision. That means that a judge, or in this case, a group of judges and lords in London, in the Privy Council, decided that according to a very obscure clause in the Constitution which states the federal government is responsible for peace, order, and good government, that meant that the federal government would pick up all these extra areas of jurisdiction that hadn't been explicitly divided to one side or the other.
Okay, so I'm guessing that there was, in that case, a lot of powers that weren't given out in 1867.
Yeah, and interestingly, this is for different reasons. There were some areas, such as we mentioned health and education, and we talked about this before in the Bridge. At the time, these were mostly taken care of by the church, so it wasn't seen as very important or as important, and it was given to the provinces. Of course, now that consumes the lion's share of public funding. So It's kind of an interesting story. So moving on from federalism, we know that this is the principle which is behind our project. We also like to pick up specific items that are in the news and which show more about the societies of each province. Of course, that's part of our mission. So one of the topics that Hugo and I found were interesting was this topic of the Quebec Charter of Values. So Hugo, what is the Quebec Charter of Values?
Well, it's the idea behind it is to create a quasi-judicial or constitutional, actually, quasi-constitutional law, which would, in effect, legalize social practices that are seen as shared by most or all Quebecers. So it would be a kind of evolution on the current Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we have both in Canada and in Quebec.
Okay, and so that's a bit interesting. Quebec has its own charter, which is different from the Canadian charter.
It does. It speaks more to civil liberties and to the relationship with the state. The Canadian charter is very broad, very generalist, and with the great universal principles like the freedom of belief, expression, and so on and so forth. but the Quebec Charter is more precise. And this idea of this Charter of Values would actually be to simply, how should I say this, legalize French Canadians' way of life as the way of life for all Quebecers.
So I know that you mentioned when we were discussing this that there's a conservative element to this legislation. Why do we want this legislation, and who wants this? Who wants this legislation?
Well, I think that I don't think anybody really wants it. It's more of an electoral ploy. This is all about the PQ gaining back its identity foothold that it lost in 2007 to the ADQ, a party which is now, well, no longer exists. So the idea is to go and get rural Quebecers, the how should I say this, Québécois de souche, the French Canadian Quebecers, to rally behind the PQ through this kind of conservative return to the roots legislation.
Okay, and what exactly does this legislation ban? How exactly does it function in practice?
Well, so far we have the PQ has been very tight-lipped about the precise, I should say this, the precise hold of the legislation. But what has come out in the press is that it would actually really be more of a dress code for civil servants. So the idea was to ban any religious symbols for people who are actually judges, police officers, healthcare workers, teachers, and so on and so forth. And very recently, the PQ has told us that they will be coming out, actually next week, September 9th, they're coming out of their conservative closet, and they will be telling the province exactly what they're looking for.
Okay, and so how does this legislation, potential legislation, it's got to be said, how does this interact with the Canadian Charter?
Well, that's for now unclear in the sense that we can, I mean, we can speculate as much as we want. The idea, I think, as we talked about earlier, is that the Canadian Charter would actually overrule this Charter of Values, because freedom of religion is, you know, I think it's a third or fourth article in the Constitution, and it's a judicial reality. So this charter would be overruled in any kind of any court, in any kind of judicial contestation of its content. That being said, the PQ and Pauline Marois have clearly stated that they would be willing to use the notwithstanding clause in the Constitution, meaning that the Constitution does not apply to this law, and thus we would have this charter of social preferences.
Okay, well, interesting stuff. I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about what exactly the notwithstanding clause is and how it applies and how it came to be. But that's it for today. So remember to come back and watch. We'll be posting these videos. Keep an eye out as well. We're going to be on Troy Media. We're going to have a new monthly article entitled The Bridge, which will consist of back-to-back articles with myself and Hugo. So we'll be posting those, and come back and see what happens in the future. So thanks a lot. Thanks, Hugo.
All right. Have a nice day.